So welcome everybody, good afternoon. My name is Rachel Brockle. I'm the director of the litigation program here at Golden Gate University School of Law in San Francisco. We want to thank you for attending our panel today hosted by the Litigation Center. It's a seminar on the topic of ghost guns and how ghost guns impact law enforcement and litigation. So we have a very distinguished panel of professionals here to speak with you today. That includes our moderator, Stephen Stock, who is a senior investigative reporter with NBC Bay Area News, a Giffords litigator, Hannah Shearer, a Brady litigator, Jon Lowy, and LA Law Enforcement Chief Chris Marks. So some of you may have noticed that Sheriff Alex Villanueva is not here with us today. He did have a conflict, but Chief Marks very kindly volunteers to take his spot, and I know he'll be an excellent speaker because he is the he's the head of the detective division down in LA County. So thank you very much, Chief Marks, for stepping in today. So your hosts today will be myself, Rachel Brockle, the litigation director, and also our graduate Baxter Fellow, Clodagh Mocklin. She's here as well. So what will happen is you can ask questions right now, you can ask questions during the panel or even towards the end. Myself and Chloe will be monitoring the chat so as not to interrupt the speakers. If we do think a question is relevant to the topic that's being discussed, we will ask that question to the panelists. And if we think it's something that can wait till the end that maybe is unrelated to the current topic, we will save those questions. So we'll be monitoring and making sure that questions that come in get asked. I also wanted to mention, stay tuned until the end. We do have one panel related raffle. It's a prize that will go to someone from the audience. You may not be able to see each other, but we can see all of you in our participants list. So, so we said again, ask your questions in the chat, wait till the end for your questions if you want, and also wait till the end because we will have a raffle that's related to the panel today. So without further ado, I would like to go ahead and introduce our panelists, starting with our moderator, Stephen Stock, and I'll give you some biography information about each of them. So only a couple weeks after landing in the Bay Area, Stephen Stock had California's governor and state assembly scrambling to address an environmental issue he uncovered: the unregulated practice of widespread hydraulic fracturing, commonly known as fracking, for oil in California. It's a practice that's become widespread, but was little known until Mr. Stock uncovered it. So now lawmakers and regulators in Sacramento have moved to address the issues that Mr. Stock has uncovered. One of those topics he's looked into has been ghost guns. So that's why he's here helping us moderate this panel today. A little more than a year after Mr. Stock exposed the rise in the number of close calls between airplanes in the skies over the Bay Area and the country, the National Transportation Safety Board released new safety recommendations to the FAA to address the issues raised in that report. He has also uncovered the still little regulated practice of having children as young as 8 years old work in the fields of America, from California's Central Valley to North Carolina's Tobacco Road. He's also exposed the number of people voting in California in the name of dead residents, a rise in the number of high-quality fake IDs in the US, which is now creating a homeland security threat, campaign finance ties between Silicon Valley and the halls of political power, and questionable federal stimulus spending. So he's got a lot of different topics he's researched, investigated. I'm sure that's not the whole list. I think that's just what's on the NBC Bay Area News website. I'm sure the list goes on and on and on, but we're very excited to have Mr. Stock moderating our panel today. Next up, we have Hannah Shearer. She's the litigation director for Giffords Law Center, and she's a little more local to us here in San Francisco. Hannah Shearer joined Giffords Law Center as a staff attorney and Second Amendment specialist in June of 2016. She's now the organization's litigation director. Hannah tracks and analyzes court cases involving the Second Amendment and manages Giffords Law Center's amicus brief program, in which her legal experts participate in crucial firearms litigation as friends of the court. Hannah also oversees Giffords Law Center's legislative work in 5 states, drafting bills and providing gun policy expertise to legislators and advocates working to enact life-saving gun laws. Hannah's the author of Giffords Law Center's, trying to say that as perfectly as I can, post-Heller litigation summary, which is a comprehensive survey of Second Amendment decisions issued by state and federal courts since 2008. She regularly provides information and commentary on the Second Amendment and state firearm laws to media outlets, and she's been featured in the Los Angeles Times, U.S. News and World Report, and Vice, among other publications. Before joining Giffords Law Center, Hannah worked as a litigation associate at Munger, Tolles & Olson, LLP in San Francisco, and as a law clerk to Judge Paul J. Watford of the U.S. Court of Appeals of the Ninth Circuit. Hannah received her undergraduate degree from Yale University and her JD from Stanford Law School. So thank you, Hannah, for being here with us today. And then we have Jonathan E. Lowey, who's the Vice President, Legal and Chief Counsel at Brady. Since 1997, John has argued in courts across the country to reduce gun violence. He's provided pro bono legal representation to victims of gun violence in lawsuits to reform dangerous gun industry practices, and he's assisted government and public officials in defense of reasonable gun laws. In fact, he even filed the very first victim lawsuit against the ghost gun industry. John has litigated in over 40 states, successfully arguing several precedent-setting cases in appellate and trial courts, establishing gun industry liability and Second Amendment law, obtaining several multi-million-dollar settlements, and reforming gun industry practices. John has been named one of the 500 leading lawyers in America by Law Dragon magazine for the past 10 years, and he's published numerous articles on gun litigation and policy, including The Right Not to Be Shot, Public Safety, Private Guns, and the Constellation of Constitutional Liberties, which was in the Georgetown Journal of Law and Policy. He graduated from Harvard College and the University of Virginia School of Law. So Mr. Lowy, thank you as well for being here today. And then last but not least, Chief Chris Marks, who began his career with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department in 1987. As a deputy, he worked various assignments in the custody division and spent time as a patrol deputy and detective at Century and Industry Stations. In 2001, he was promoted to the rank of sergeant and transferred to Norwalk Station. In 2004, he was selected to serve at the operations as the operations sergeant for the division chief of field operations region 3 in the South Patrol. In 2006, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant, transferred to the Lakewood Station, where he served as watch commander, service area lieutenant, and detective bureau lieutenant. He later transferred to Operations Safe Streets Bureau, working as an area lieutenant, operations lieutenant, and acting captain. Chief Marks then served as the operations lieutenant at Temple Station. In 2014, he was promoted to the rank of captain and given the honor of commanding Carson Station. In late 2016, Chief Marks was selected to command the newly created Human Trafficking Bureau. Chief Marks was promoted to the rank of commander in 2018 and assigned to Detective Division Headquarters. In 2021, here we are now, Chief Marks promoted to the rank of chief and remained in his assignment at the department's Detective Division. Since 2013, Chief Marks has led the department's efforts to test and implement body-worn cameras. Chief Marks has authored several department policies, including management and enforcement of gang injunctions and body-worn cameras. Chief Marks has served as a department leader for the department's incident management team, and he holds a Bachelor of Science degree in criminal justice management. So thank you, Chief Marks, for being here as well and stepping in today for the sheriff. So this is our distinguished panel here for you. So now what I will do is I'll turn over the microphone to Mr. Stock to handle the moderation. So thank you again for moderating the panel today.
You bet. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everybody for joining us. We really appreciate your time. Chief Marks, John, and Hannah, thanks so much for being patient with us. And as we have this conversation, I really want to focus on just talking, like we're sitting around having a glass of wine or a beer or smoking a cigar and just sort of talk and put all these issues out on the table, as I know the folks who are listening are really highly interested in what we have to say. Chief, let me start with you. I've just had sources in the last couple of weeks. I'm probably giving away my secrets. We're working on a follow-up to some of the work we did a couple of years back. And I had a source in law enforcement say, I don't know why people would smuggle guns into California anymore because it's so easy to make your own. Are you concerned about what's called technically we call them ghost guns, but technically they're self-made unserialized firearms. That's the technical name ATF likes to use. Does it concern you when you can't trace a gun?
Oh, absolutely. And why criminals or people that are prohibited from having firearms, they no longer have to break into a car, look in a trunk, break into a house, steal a gun. They can just simply either go online and buy an 80%er and build it themselves, or go down the street to the local person in the neighborhood that's building them. Just as an example, last week, our gang investigators from our Operation Safe Streets Bureau served a search warrant at a house following an assault with a deadly weapon. They recovered inside that house 8 polymer 89 millimeter frames, 3 223, which are AR-15 80% frames, 20 pounds of marijuana, and $10,000 in cash. Now, under California law, this is still an ongoing investigation, but those 80%ers, unless they've been touched, they're not against the law to possess, but we know as cops what those are going to be used for and what they're going to wind up doing on the street.
So Chief, great answer. And I want to pull back a little bit, and we're going to talk about a lot of stuff. Tell those who aren't aware, what is an 80%er? What do you mean by that? I know what you mean, but if you're uninitiated, what's that mean?
I think Hannah and John might do a better job of describing it than I would because they practice this, but basically it's the lower portion of the gun. It's the frame of the gun. And to make it 80%, there's still some modifications that have not been completed, but with a Dremel or a file or a drill in a garage, you can actually make it a gun with just a few quick moments if you know what you're doing.
And our story, we actually see a guy make a gun in his garage doing just what the chief described. Hannah, let's talk about this. The law sort of allows this to happen. You don't have to register if you have an 80%. I just yesterday got an email from a gun group that said, buy all these parts online. You can get them. How do you deal with that when you're trying to sort of see how bad the guns are and regulate it? How do you at the Gifford Center deal with this?
Thanks, Stephen. And just to step back a bit and go back to to defining some terms that we're talking about. So a firearm frame or receiver is really the central component of a firearm that houses the hammer and the bolt and the breech block, as well as the firing mechanism. But what ghost gun purveyors are selling is an unfinished frame or receiver that's blank. And that's significant because federal regulators have decided that it's significant whether or not it has impressions or indentations or holes that need to be drilled to complete the firearm. And so through this workaround, ghost gun sellers are providing 80% receivers for long guns and 80% frames for handguns that are not classified as firearms under federal law, even though they're created for the only purpose, the express purpose of then being easily finished, drilled, and becoming a completed firearm. And so that's disturbing, not only because these are guns that can be made, somebody can make them in their garage using simple hand tools. They don't have to undergo a background check. There's certain other federal requirements, basic firearm regulations that don't apply to these weapons. They're not serialized, and sellers aren't required to keep records of the initial retail purchaser, which means that after they're used in a crime, it's not possible to trace back to the initial purchaser. And it's not possible to enforce laws like waiting periods, and it's possible to order these online and just get them shipped directly to one's door. So we're concerned about these because they really undermine every gun law that my organization advocates for and that we depend on to keep people safe. So it's the number one problem that we're facing because it affects every other policy area that we work on.
And is it true that it's even particularly difficult when Chief Marks and his people are out there recovering these, that as you say, or as he said, you get an 80%, there's nothing you can do about it. There's no illegal, and we can't even agree on terms about that. If it doesn't have a hole drilled in it, you can't pursue that. It's just a hunk of plastic or metal. Is that also part of this difficulty, that the law just won't agree on such things? When I did the story ATF, didn't want to call them ghost guns. We can't even agree on terminology. Is that part of this issue?
I'm happy to answer that quickly because it gets into litigation. My organization and the state of California are actually litigating that issue because from our perspective, federal law is pretty clear. It covers, I want to read the exact federal definition just to get it exactly right. So under federal law, under the Gun Control Act of 1968, A firearm includes any weapon that is designed to or can readily be converted to expel a projectile by the action of an explosive, as well as the frame or receiver of any such weapon. So that's why I think we can agree a frame and receiver is covered, but we argue these are things that can readily be converted into a firearm under federal law, into a frame or receiver that's clearly covered. And so the state of California and Giffords Law Center and two individuals whose children were killed at Saugus High School, a terrible shooting down in Southern California, where the perpetrator was another student who used a ghost gun, are suing the ATF under the Administrative Procedure Act, trying to require the federal government to treat ghost gun components as firearms. But ATF's position thus far has been, we think, an irrational one, which is that if it doesn't have the holes, it's not a frame or receiver or something that can readily be converted into a firearm.
Perfect. This segues right into John. John, I want to ask you, do we need to better define this in the law, either at the congressional or at the state level? Because there are people that disagree with Hannah. That's why she's having to litigate this. You know, well, it doesn't have a hole. It's just a hunk of metal. It's not really a receiver. It's, I don't know, Chief Marks is right. I don't know what else you would make it, but it could be a dead weight. I don't know. It could be a paperweight. The fact of the matter is, some of this is vague. And does that need to be clarified?
Well, I think it does. I mean, but for one, I mean, the position that Hannah and her organization Giffords are making court is exactly right. I mean, ATF could be interpreting the law sensibly and correctly. And in fact, they used to. If you go back a couple of decades, they were interpreting this provision to basically mean if you had something that you could fairly easily convert into a gun, it was a gun. And then they changed that standard to make it much more hyper technical, and it's much less logical now. So, ATF should change back to its other view. If you can make something readily converted into a gun, it should be classified as a gun, and they can do that. They can do it today. Now, if they're not going to do that, then I think Congress has got to step in, and they can change the law, and they should. And there are a number of proposals out there in Congress, as well as states, that would, prevent these ghost guns. That would require serialization, would require background checks, and fill up this loophole.
You know, you raise another good question, John, and there was just a week ago in the Wall Street Journal a story that now ATF, because of the new administration, is in fact having meetings behind the scenes to do just what you said, change their approach. Of course, does that change every time there's a new administration? Has this become so political? I understand the gun debate and Second Amendment, that's political, but now we're talking about holes in a piece of plastic. That becomes political. And do we need more clarification so there is no wiggle room depending on your political bent?
Well, the best solution would be to pass a law, would make it totally clear, make it so even if there's a hostile administration to gun safety laws, there's nothing ATF could do to allow this sort of irresponsible conduct.
This is terrific. You guys have kicked us off to a great start. I think what we'll do now, if we could, Rachel, is play that story to sort of put it more into context that we just did a story a couple of years on this issue, and then we'll rejoin it and we'll talk a little bit more about it to put this whole issue into sort of perspective. Let's play the story that we worked on a couple of years ago here at NBC Bay Area.
San Diego. This is police body cam video just released by the San Diego County District Attorney this week. It shows two officers hit by gunfire from a homemade untraceable gun. Both officers did survive, and the gunman took his own life in the shootout last year.
But law enforcement officials say this incident and many others point to a growing problem that puts you at risk: the rise of what are known as ghost guns. Senior investigator Stephen Stock discovered they're becoming a bigger threat than really ever before, Stephen.
Exactly right, Jessica. They're technically called self-made unserialized firearms. We teamed with NBC LA and NBC San Diego, as well as with the nonprofit journalism organization The Trace, to investigate these ghost guns. And we found as many as a third of all guns now being recovered here in California by law enforcement are ghost guns.
Here's an 80% lower blank.
A hunk of metal bought over the internet.
At this point, this is not actually considered a firearm. We're about to change that.
With a little skill and knowledge turned into a firearm in this Stockton garage.
So basically, you just start it and then slowly.
You too can make what's known on the street as a ghost gun.
All right, now I'm going to put in the hammer.
No serial number.
Oh, this is the buffer tube.
No way to track or to trace it. These gun hobbyists ask us to refer to them as just Bob and Hugh. They live in the Central Valley and make their own guns all the time.
And it's complete.
They say they obey a new California law requiring them to put a serial number on each gun and to register it.
Yes, I love the building process because I get to problem solve. I get to design it myself. I get to take something from a bunch of parts and scraps and put them together and make a functional machine out of it.
Both Bob and Hugh admit others don't always follow the rules, building or selling these guns to skirt California's tough firearms laws. Law enforcement tells us that ghost guns are now flooding the market, especially in strict gun control states.
That makes the rest of us who want to follow the law and want to do things right, that makes the rest of us look bad.
From the 2017 mass shootings in Rancho Tehama to the 2014 bank robbery and shootout in Stockton, to a shootout with San Jose police in 2016, the suspects in each case used self-made, untraceable ghost guns.
It was probably one of the scariest moments of my life because it just felt like everything slowed down.
Jennifer Majors faced down a ghost gun with her partners on the beat, Jeff McNair and Mel Dunn.
It looked like it was some sort of rifle.
Pretty much he came out firing as he stuck the gun out the window.
This is that homemade gun that the suspect was using when the three officers responded to a shots fired call and pulled his car over outside this subway.
I see this gold rifle coming out the window, and I don't know why, but I thought, wow, that's a really nice looking gun. And all of a sudden a round starts flying at me.
Officers tell us these stories are becoming more and more common.
From the serial numbers perspective, it is untraceable.
Police Chief Eddie Garcia says that poses a threat not only to his officers, but also to residents.
Obviously, 30 years ago, people weren't getting on the internet and getting these kits to make homemade weaponry.
But we discovered that few agencies actually track ghost guns. Not the feds, not the state, and only a handful of local law enforcement agencies do it.
There's no way for us to track this. It actually comes to you like this.
For years, Graham Barlow has been investigating the proliferation of unserialized firearms as resident agent in charge of ATF's Sacramento field office.
What we're finding are that people that are in the business of selling firearms to criminal organizations, this has become a very profitable endeavor for them.
What's a gun like this go for on the street?
It's not uncommon to see them go from anywhere from $1,000 to $2,500.
That's 4 times more than a regular gun. And while there may be no official statistics, an investigation by NBC California stations teamed with a nonprofit organization, The Trace, found that law enforcement agencies across the state are recovering record numbers of ghost guns. According to several ATF sources, 30% of all guns now recovered in many communities are ghost guns.
We've seen machine shops where they are lining them up and completing them in 20-minute intervals with 3 or 4 machines going at once.
You would acknowledge that right now California law appears to have no teeth when it comes to ghost guns.
Absolutely.
That's why Assemblyman Mike Gibson of Compton has proposed a new bill to require even critical parts that Bob and Hugh and others use to build guns to be sold only by licensed registered dealers, allowing closer tracking.
We're talking about our technology and our laws. Some of them are outdated, and we have to make sure that our laws are advancing as our technology advances in this country.
Actually, once you start this manufacturing process.
ATF's Barlow worries about what will happen if these laws don't keep up.
I don't want to be an alarmist. A segment of the people that are out there that want these products are criminals, and they are going to want cheaper, more effective, more reliable more lethal firearms.
Back in the Central Valley, Bob says he understands the need for some regulation, but he says he also hopes lawmakers don't go too far.
And that's just going to create a bigger headache for us trying to follow the laws.
Several law enforcement officials also told me they believe there should be a larger effort by both lawmakers and their own agencies to actually collect data and track these ghost guns more closely. As one law enforcement official put it to me, quote, "We can't really address this threat until we know exactly how bad the problem really is."
And that's
so
the big
that's
issue.
the next big step. That's
Okay.
right.
How do you track the ghost gun?
You literally can't until it's been fired and used in a crime. And then, of course, you could use NIBIN, which we've talked about. But before that, it's untraceable.
Okay, thank you very
You
much,
bet,
Stephen. Now, if you have a
Okay. Chris, Chief, you guys track ghost guns?
Well, when we recover them, the deputies are supposed to contact the state DOJ and they receive a number for the firearm manufactured by unlicensed subject. And that tags a number to it, but that's our tracking. There's no going back. As a cop, we want to go back and backtrack and get to the source of it. We can't do that unless the person that has it tells us where they got it from. We're dead in the water.
Great point. Does that need to change, John?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the fixes is to require serial numbers on all of these parts so that, even if they're put together, they would be traced. And in California, they should be subjected to all of the registration and record keeping requirements that California law imposes. I mean, that's, one of the great tragedies, particularly in a place like California, where you've stepped up, enacted really strong laws, as a result, reduced gun violence by, huge proportions. And then the industry, or some sectors of the industry, designs around it and, subverts that law.
And does it take sort of a unified thing? I mean, California can do one thing, but then Virginia can do another. And so you have this hodgepodge of, what's legal one way and what's legal another. That it seems to me, without a unifying federal law, you're dead in the water.
Ultimately, you will want a federal law. I mean, for all of these gun laws, because of gun trafficking. I mean, in California, you have people go to Nevada and traffic guns across the border. So that you're going to have that problem unless you get, all states, or more likely a federal solution.
Another reason, just to build on that answer, that a federal law and policy change is needed is because right now, because federal law doesn't consider ghost gun components to be firearms, the federal background check system isn't available to run background checks on those components. So that's why states like California are limited in their own laws that they can pass, and why the state can require serialization but can't necessarily get a federal background check on people who are just buying what's designated as unfinished frames and receivers.
Hannah, can you tell us about other types of cases that you may have litigated involving these guns?
Sure, Stephen. There's a lot out there, so I'll give some broad categories and then happy to build on any that are worth further discussion. So I mentioned that there's Administrative Procedure Act litigation, which is the theory that you bring cases under when you want a federal agency to fix its interpretation of the law, or correct something that's arbitrary and capricious as the legal standard. And so our argument in those cases is that ATF's standard, where it doesn't consider how easy it is to build a completed firearm out of these parts, but rather just categorizes it based on whether it's blank or has holes drilled in it, isn't consistent with the text of the statute and is also arbitrary and capricious. I'll mention there's other litigation that's proceeding under that theory on a different, or on a similar theory on a different issue we haven't talked about yet, which is 3D printed guns. We've been talking about kits or parts you can order online and build in your garage. There's also a growing problem where files to use a 3D printer to print firearms that can't be detected by a metal detector are in wider circulation. And there's an important lawsuit now that has managed to successfully block a policy change that the Trump administration tried to implement, which would have deregulated files for 3D printed guns by removing them from the US munitions list and removing State Department oversight over these files, because it creates a national security threat when over the internet, people all around the world can download a file that if they've got a 3D printer, they can actually create a gun that way. And so that problem, I don't want to make more of it than the kinds of guns that you can way more easily build from kits, like the traditional ghost guns that we've been talking about. But that is a threat. And so there's a lawsuit that was brought by Washington State with California's participation and a number of other states to use the Administrative Procedure Act to block changes by the Trump administration. They have succeeded so far, but that case is on appeal. So maybe I'll pause there, but there's also, there's other theories that people are pursuing. There's state attorney general's offices that have brought enforcement actions against ghost gun companies, alleging that their practices violate state consumer protection laws. And there's also been a new avenue where cities, including the city of Los Angeles, are suing ghost gun companies for violating consumer protection laws, and also under nuisance and tort theories. So there's ways to go after individual companies, and then there's these broader theories I talked about that try to get a legal reclassification on the federal agency level.
Fantastic. Thank you. The terrific answer. I want to peel back a little bit on the 3D. That's sort of the sexy thing we hear in the media, not to bash my own business, but, in fact, when we did our investigation, at least right now, the technology for 3D, the guns really are not that usable. They're pretty rudimentary. But as the lawmaker Gibson from Compton pointed out, if we don't get ahead of it, the technology is advancing, and it could well be that we're going to start having 3D printer guns that you can literally use on the street almost instantly if we don't get in front of it as a legal society. Would you agree with that, Hannah?
Yes, I think that's right. And if you think about a circumstance where it might cause a huge problem is when you're able to, even if the 3D printed gun is not reliable, if it can only fire a few bullets, if you get that through a metal detector, a perpetrator can do a lot of damage, even if the gun conks out, and so I think it is about just trying to get ahead of the problem, as opposed to with the 80% frames and receivers we've been talking about, the kits, that's just a growing problem that the law has not stayed in front of.
And just to clarify for those who may not know, just in case, 3D printer guns can go through metal detectors. Unless you've got metal components in them, you print it on 3D, resin or plastic, it goes right, it is not detectable as far as metal detectors. Chief, LA suing some of the manufacturers. I want to talk a little bit more about this high school, Saugus High School. I mean, that has got to send, real worries. You're head of the detective division. You got to be worried not only for your community, but for your men and women who are on the line here.
Yeah, we do. And Hannah brought up a good point that a lot of these 80% built guns, they're not quality guns. They often malfunction. They'll explode when they're shooting. We had an officer involved shooting where a suspect pulled the gun out and it literally came apart as he was pulling out and pointing at the deputy. And you wonder, you scratch, you arrive to one of those scenes, you go, how does a gun fall apart? And then you realize, oh, okay, it's one of those. So yeah, it is a real concern. And, we did experience a horrific event back in 2019 at the Saugus High School where, a 16-year-old on his birthday brought a ghost gun to school.
Did he make it? Have you ever been able to determine? Where did he get it?
Yeah, well, he ended up, after he tragically murdered two fellow students, taking his own life. We believe that it came from his father, but we're not, we can't for certain say that. But his father had lost his right to possess weapons, but was believed to be a gun enthusiast. And so the theory is that he turned to ghost guns to continue continue that hobby. And then he was no longer in the house, and he came in possession of a ghost gun, and that's when that tragic day happened, and 2 young kids lost their life.
If you and John and Hannah could team up, what do you need as a law enforcement officer? What would you like to see happen right away to help fix this problem? More data collection? I just throw it out there. You get to pick. If you're king or president, what would you like to see to help law enforcement combat this issue?
So this is a tough one, as you can see. That's why we're here. But in the immediate future, right now, today, is to be able to just, these 80%ers, call them what they are, call them a firearm, put a serial number on them. If people want to buy them, that's great. Go through the DROS process, the dealer's report of sale process, go through the background process. It's yours, you get it the same way. And then we have a way of tracking these backwards to solve crimes.
John, I got to ask you the same question. I mean, if you had a crack at it, you get one wish, what do you think needs to happen and happen right away in order to better get our handle around this? I mean, as the chief said, and you saw in our story, we don't even really know the extent of the problem. And I got to tell you, I don't want to give away my secrets, but it took us a long time to get sources to even give us the 30% estimate for the use of ghost guns, at least here in California, because they just don't want to admit it's a problem, or they don't even know it's a problem. What do you think needs to happen in order to better address this?
Well, I think the chief was right. I mean, treat them as guns and, subject them to all of the rules of guns, which would be serial numbers, background checks, and in California, the DROS process. And, as you said before, this is already in the law. I mean, if the ATF simply said, when the law says if it may readily be converted to expel a projectile, that's a gun. Well, these ghost guns can be readily converted to do exactly that. So they are. So if ATF was interpreting the law properly, this problem would be solved. But, given that they aren't, we need to have congressional action. Let me just add on to, Hannah was listing the types of litigation. There's one other type, which is to address this problem, which is on behalf of victims against the companies. And particularly at Brady, for over 30 years, we've been bringing legal actions on behalf of victims against the gun industry. And we have a couple of lawsuits against ghost gun companies. And that's another way where you can, go after the problem and hold those companies accountable so that they can, have to internalize the damage that they're causing. And that sort of litigation has changed practices. It's forced some companies out of business and sometimes forced settlements where companies agreed to enact some reforms before legislatures did.
I want to pick up on what John just said, Hannah, and that is that, I mean, I know I'm using a short-term word. Is that a faster, more effective way than trying to legislate or to lobby Congress to change the law? Bottom line, if you are successful in suing, is that a quicker or easier? I use the word easier and quick. None of this is quick and easy, but is lawsuit civilly versus trying to change legal criminal law? Is that a more effective way to achieve these same ends?
I think they're both critically important strategies, and it's important to pursue both at the same time. The important litigation that Brady's working on, that John described, could be faster and more direct if it hits companies in the pocketbook and makes it easier for them to just adopt responsible business practices. It's low-hanging fruit in some respects because these companies are not marketing to legitimate hobbyists. Their customer is not the 2 individuals that you interviewed who are complying with the laws. A lot of these companies are there's companies that have provided bulk discounts, like you can get these kits in 5 or 10 packs. They're selling jig kits that make it, extremely easy to, it's like for people who have trouble with IKEA furniture, which I'd put myself in, making it even easier. And, expensive machines that do all the machining for you. And really the only reason to buy one of those is if you're going to assemble these in bulk and then you're a gun trafficker. So, and then just the way that, the online sales just have people certify, I'm old enough to buy this, I'm complying with all the laws without doing any of the work on their own to ensure that that's the case. So I think going after those companies could be an incredibly powerful tool at correcting those business practices. At the same time, if you go after a company and they just declare bankruptcy and another one pops up, you're going to want an overarching solution. You're going to want a federal law or agency policy change.
Yeah, and to put a fine, not too fine a point on it, I mean, the ATF gentleman that we interviewed described just what Hannah described, that they would show up, his agents will show up, and they're literally like an assembly line with these tools and all that, which you don't keep that around just to do a little hobbying. You're manufacturing like a manufacturing location right in the middle of, in somebody's backyard, but they're churning out guns as if they are a manufacturer. Are there any bills on the horizon that you think have a possibility of being passed that could have an impact on this in the near future? I'll start with you, John.
Sure, there are a number of them, and I don't know what the vote count is, but I do think that there is. I think there's a chance for a lot of good gun violence prevention legislation. I mean, maybe these in particular because it does not affect the gun industry, the classic gun industry, as much. Your Glocks and Berettas and Colts. In fact, in some ways, these companies are competitors to those companies. So you may not see the resistance, full-throated resistance that you would with some other bills. So, I mean, certainly, and there are a number of bills requiring serialization and basically treating these guns as firearms. And so I'm certainly hopeful.
Chief, do you see anything on the horizon that's going to help you and your people on the street?
No.
Combat this?
Nope. I haven't heard of anything that's going to slow this down. You basically have anybody can buy one of these. Anybody that's unlicensed can make them. Anybody can acquire them without a background check. They're unmarked, they're unserialized, they're untraceable.
Are you seeing a rise? I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Are you seeing more and more of these?
So obviously I'm not out on the streets, but I get to see all the fruits of our people's labor. And the majority of the pictures that come across my computer every week, I look at those guns and I can tell the difference. And I see most of those are what we would call polymer or built guns. You can tell the difference in quality. I think the first 2 months, just the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department alone, we've collected or seized almost 700 of these. So yeah, our numbers are definitely rising.
Wow. Thank you, Chief. Hannah, what do you see on the horizon? Are there any bills, anything that may address this in the near term?
Well, it's very sobering to realize that from the law enforcement perspective, help does not appear to be coming. I think the fastest way to help with the problem would be if there's a federal policy change. The ATF under President Biden could potentially deal with the lawsuits against ATF by treating ghost gun components as firearms. That could also be accomplished through legislation, but I think that would be a more drawn out process. And then when it comes to state actions, the state legislatures are limited in what they can do when there isn't a federal law, when they don't have access to the federal background check system, and when law enforcement is just running into this problem that they're untraceable and just popping up in increasing numbers. So, and then there is the litigation that we've been talking about, but that takes time. The pace of litigation is so slow. Our goal with the administrative procedure lawsuit that we have is to order ATF to to treat ghost gun components as firearms if they don't do it on their own. And then litigation against individual companies is really trying to shut them down or get them to reform their practices. But I think that's a ways out.
I want to take a pause here and see if Rachel and Clodagh have any questions that are from our audience that they may want to ask. Rachel? Clodagh?
Yes, we did have a question come in. We're wanting to know if any of the panelists have ever completed an 80% lower. Have any of you had experience yourselves putting one of those together, it sounds like?
Not me.
I have not.
I would not want to sit on a couch that I've constructed from IKEA. I certainly would not. Constructed.
We had one more that came in that said, how often are 3D printed ghost guns used in crime compared to the completed 80% lower ghost guns?
I'm sorry, Rachel, could you repeat that one more time?
Yes. How often are 3D printed ghost guns used in crime compared to the completed 80% lower ghost guns?
The 3D versus the 80% guys, any idea? Chief?
So we handle those both the same as far as tracking. But I'm going to tell you just from visually, my high level view is the majority of the recoveries we have are the polymers just because they're so easy and accessible and inexpensive to get.
Whereas a 3D printer might be more expensive. I don't have any numbers. Maybe John or Hannah can jump in. But when we did our investigation, you know, we didn't ever actually build one, but we saw someone build one and the bullet went sideways. And I mean, it's very not accurate. Whereas you get the 80% that Chief's talking about, and you can get it anywhere. I just, like I said, got an email yesterday selling me, you know, trying to sell me parts. Why go through all that when you can get an 80, which fires just like it's a real gun once you're done. So I will say that so far the 3D doesn't seem to proliferate as much as sort of it's been out there, because, you know, it sounds kind of cool to be able to just put a printer and turn on and print out a gun. Hannah, John, do you have any numbers of that? What the difference between 3D and the 80%?
I think what you've said, it sounds right to me, and it's hard to come by the numbers, especially because, you know, it's just law enforcement on the ground that's trying to trace them and classify them. But yeah, I think that right now it's still pretty expensive to get a good 3D printer. They might have low end models for a few $100s, but I don't know if that's going to get you where you need to be.
Good. Other questions?
Yeah, there's a few more questions. There was one that was left in the chat, and the panelists touched on this a bit, but maybe we can address it more directly. This question is, what would you say to proponents of the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution that feel that regulating the use, that regulating ghost guns infringes on their Second Amendment right to bear arms?
I can offer my answer and then see if anyone else wants to weigh in. The Second Amendment, as the Supreme Court has interpreted it, as it says it's a well-regulated right, the Second Amendment is consistent with basic gun regulations, like a background check, like a serial number. Courts have upheld a serialization requirement against a Second Amendment argument. There's no right to have a gun that's a secret, that doesn't have a serial number, that it can't be traced or, you know, dealt with responsibly if it's lost or stolen or used in a crime. So I think that the Second Amendment is consistent with the types of basic regulations that ghost guns are just completely avoiding. And so, and the other thing I'll add is that there are people, I think, who are hobbyists who want to build these guns, and they've got Second Amendment interests, but I think those people are perfectly willing to follow the rules and go get a background check if that becomes possible, put a serial number on it. And so really the much bigger concern is gun traffickers, people who are prohibited from buying guns permissibly under the Second Amendment because they have a violent criminal record, and those people are the ones that are exploiting the lack of regulation. And so I see it as not a Second Amendment issue. It's really just there hasn't been a appropriate regulations applied to these devices, and if they are, that'll protect responsible people's Second Amendment rights while getting at this horrible problem that we've all been talking about.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I mean, the Second Amendment a lot of times is just sort of thrown out as an objection to gun violence prevention without, looking at it exactly as Hannah, did. And, Second Amendment does not give you a right to the gun of your choice, does not give you a right to an assault weapon. It does not give you the right to make the gun of your choice. I mean, the fact is that you still can get conventional handguns, conventional rifles, conventional shotguns. So your Second Amendment right would not be infringed if you prohibited ghost guns. And certainly if you simply regulated them and treated them like firearms, there would be absolutely no Second Amendment problem.
Another question I see in the chat is, since 3D printing and ghost gun production seem too difficult to trace without swift action, is there a way to place heavier restrictions on bullet purchases? So I guess kind of linking bullet purchases to ghost guns, is there any connection there that would be helpful?
I think that's an idea that's been tried. California actually tried to impose background checks on ammunition purchases, and it's been challenged in court. So there was actually some litigation over California's ammunition background check process. I think it's a good idea, but I don't know. I think that the scope of this problem is so large that you have to be thinking about the guns themselves in addition to ammunition, which at this point has just been so unregulated for so long that there's lots of ammunition out there.
Yeah, I wanted to jump on what Hannah said. She's absolutely right. We did some research on that. California did try to sort of address, well, okay, we can't regulate guns. This is we by the collective we, not me. And that they then tried the ammunition, and that was challenged somewhat successfully in court. So while it may sound like a good idea, it is more difficult and doesn't always address the problem, especially when it's one state saying, oh, we're not going to let you buy these types of ammunition, and then you drive across to Reno, Nevada, and get that ammunition, on site. So it is much more problematic than it sounds on the surface. John, did you have anything to add?
No, I think that's right. I mean, it's a good idea, though, and I think California is certainly leading the nation, as it has in a lot of things, in regulating ammunition and coming closer to treating ammunition like firearms. And it is true, if you were able to have a national system of background checks and that sort of thing, you could address some of these problems. But I agree with both of you. We're a long way from there, and there are not any really major proposals nationally that I'm aware of that would do that.
Then Stephen, I have a handful of questions left. Do you want me to ask them now, or do you want
Absolutely.
me to...
Go ahead. I think we're on a roll. This is great. You're doing great.
Perfect. So the next question is, when going after manufacturers of ghost gun parts, what can you sue them for? Can they actually be liable if their parts are found to be used in a crime? Wouldn't there be issues of causation?
Great. Let's start with you, Chief. The truth of the matter is it's hard to even trace back to who originally manufactured, is it not? And on a practical level, and then we'll talk about theoretical legal level. It's hard to overstate how untraceable this stuff is, isn't it?
Yeah, it means there's just no way to go back to find out, how many were shipped to this address. We can't, there's just no way for us to trace any of this. And on the subject of ammunition, I mean, right now, it's nearly impossible to buy ammunition. The price of ammo and the supplies there's no supply of ammunition across the nation. And the price has gone up from, a couple cents a round to $1 a round in some cases. So, but, in LA County right now, our murders are up 130% this year from last year at this time. So there's no shortage of violence, even though, ammunition is really tough to buy right now.
Terrific. John, Hannah, I'll let you take a crack at the.
Sure. Well, in a liability suit against ghost gun manufacturers or sellers, if we prevailed, if the victims prevailed, they would be forced to pay damages, which would be substantial. We're dealing with multiple deaths and very serious injuries, and also potentially injunctive relief, where the court could order the companies to take certain responsible practices as far as their sale of these products. And as far as causation, that's a issue that we face in all of our litigation at Brady on behalf of victims against conventional gun companies as well. And it's, in my view, fairly easy to overcome. It's reasonably foreseeable, particularly for these ghost gun companies, that their guns are going to be used by criminals. In fact, that's the only reason they, sell these guns without serial numbers, without complying with federal and state laws, is to basically attract people who cannot get guns legally. So it's certainly foreseeable. And as far as the difficulty of determining which company made or sold the ghost gun that was used, we believe that in cases like this, courts can hold the whole industry accountable. And that's a doctrine that's been used, market share liability, that's been used with some other products. And it's particularly useful in a case where you create a product that makes it difficult to determine if you're the one who made it and sold it. And then you should not be able to benefit from that conduct, particularly from this sort of conduct where you're doing things that subvert, federal and state law. And that's what makes it hard to detect it. So we believe that, causation can be proven in these cases.
And let's make sure, John, I think that's a really important point. Many of these folks, I don't think we're overstating. Again, when you want to play by the rules, like the two people in my story, they play by the rules. They serialize, they track it, they do all of that. When you don't want to play, that's why you're building them, in a manufacturer out in your backyard, because you're trying to skirt the rules. So you are skirting accountability by your actions to start with, right?
Yeah, there's one example. There's one ghost gun company out there that in the part of the gun where law enforcement would expect to find a serial number, there is engraved a man laughing, flipping the bird, saying, "Here's your serial number," mocking law enforcement. So it's pretty clear, what their intent is about.
Hannah, I'll let you answer the question about suing the manufacturers. Is it possible? Is it harder than it sounds? You got to be able to find out who made that gun or where did it originate from, the 80%.
I think John's answer addresses, you don't necessarily need to, if your argument is that the manufacturers and sellers should know that when they're not observing any responsible practices and verifying that people are allowed to have firearms, that they're going to be their products are going to be recovered after use in crimes when law enforcement is breaking up trafficking rings. But I do think it has been possible and may be possible in the future to try to identify the specific seller or use the litigation process to do that. If you have an idea, and then you can maybe also add like a DOE defendant to, if you suspect that it's a different company. I think that there may be some products that are more identifiable than others. Polymer 80 is a company that the city of Los Angeles and the city of Washington, D.C. have sued. And I think that their products might have some branding or some differentiating feature that lets them be able to be counted more easily. So there are numbers available, how many Polymer 80 weapons have been recovered after crime. So those are all options to try to pinpoint it a little more precisely.
Can you find some of this information out during discovery?
Yes, so if you name a defendant who you think sold the ghost gun that was used in a particular incident, you could confirm that through discovery, or you could add a DOE defendant and try to take discovery from from sellers who you think might have sold part of the gun or the entire kit.
Good. Other questions?
There's also the potential that there's evidence from the person who bought it. I mean, maybe on his phone or his computer, you've got the online order, and that may have some information.
Thank you, John. That's good. Good. Other questions?
Yes, quite a handful. So these next two questions are directed specifically at Hannah or John, but anyone can chime in. So the first question is, are you two actively facing opposition and advocating for legislation? And then are there any common strategies approaching this problem or maybe it meant the problem of bump stocks, which were or still are a prominent issue previously?
I can go first, John, but would be interested in your thoughts. I haven't had as much involvement on the legislative side of things. I imagine most gun bills get opposed and there is an active opposition. So I would guess that that's happening here. Although as John mentioned, there may be traditional manufacturers that don't want to weigh in on whether ghost gun companies should be regulated. On the bump stock issue, it's interesting because that's another problem that emerged after the federal ATF didn't classify these devices that convert an assault rifle, an AR-15 or semi-automatic rifle into a machine gun by just enabling the rifle to be fired at the same rate as a machine gun, not classifying that as falling within the federal restrictions on machine guns. And so after the Las Vegas shooting where a bump stock was used, the ATF revisited that classification, and that immediately led to a bunch of legal challenges claiming that ATF's change of position had violated the Administrative Procedure Act. One of those challenges actually recently was successful. The Sixth Circuit issued a decision last week against the ATF, finding that the agency's interpretation of whether bump stocks are prohibited as machine guns isn't consistent with federal law. So there's a chance that that is going to be thrown into question. I don't want to draw an exact parallel because I think in the ghost gun context, the agency was treating unfinished frames and receivers as firearms, and then they stopped, and we want them to start again. So there's some differences there, but they do both involve agency interpretations of federal law and are subject to Administrative Procedure Act litigation.
And to be clear, bump stocks are not a ghost gun. That's an adjustment to an actual gun. And Hannah's right. The Sixth Circuit did rule against ATF, but this was a complete change on the ghost guns by ATF. At one point, they're like, no, and then they changed politically. I have people within ATF sources who say they got whiplash because of the sudden change in the tactics or even the definitions. John, do you have further information on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, the bump stock decision that Hannah mentioned shows why it's particularly important for Congress to step in and pass a law, because that would prevent courts from doing what the Sixth Circuit did. I agree completely with Hannah, and I think the position that Gifford's taken in their ghost gun litigation is correct, and that's a good distinction. But still, the fact is you're enabling a court, if they want to rule that to strike down this ATF interpretation of the law. And the other thing is that what bump stocks shows is it's another example of sectors of the gun industry really just being extremely creative about finding ways to enable criminals to subvert the law in very dangerous ways. The gun industry is far less creative when it comes to trying to develop safety features that would prevent unintentional shootings of children. In that area, they're literally over 100 years behind the times. But when it comes to creating more lethal weapons, they're really, creating new designs all the time.
And to your point, John, there is technology available that, if your fingerprint doesn't match, the gun won't fire. I mean, you could incorporate those kind of technologies into current guns, at least going forward, and that would prevent things like children from firing guns or criminals who steal your gun from fire because it doesn't match. And yet there doesn't seem to be a lot of push from the industry when it comes to those kind of issues.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in fact, going back to around 2000, Smith & Wesson agreed in a settlement of litigation, including some litigation that we at Brady were involved in, to put in some of these safety features and actually to implement reasonable distribution practices that would prevent criminals from getting guns and children from firing guns. The gun industry worked up or sectors of the gun industry worked up a boycott against Smith & Wesson, drove them into bankruptcy. And when they emerged out, they basically, are not following and never have followed the agreement. So that, sort of shows you where the industry's head tends to be at.
Good conversation. Other questions?
Yes. Can any of the panelists give examples of some of the defects that ghost guns might have?
Chief, why don't we start with you?
So the defects would be that you're putting together polymer, which is plastic, with various other types of, we'll call it a slide, which is the top half of a handgun. When you buy a regular gun from a manufacturer, that gun is milled to, I don't want to say perfection, but it is milled to a point where it is going to work and it's not going to malfunction. Whereas you're buying a piece of polymer, you're making a few modifications, and then you're buying disparate parts to make this, for lack of a better term, Frankenstein gun. And so when you have a miniature explosion when you fire that gun. And so the slide may come off, a pin may come out, it just may jam or malfunction. So there's a lot of different things that could happen because that gun hasn't gone through a formal production process by experts that know and understand metallurgy and how all those things work.
And Chief, I'll continue to rely on you. When we're talking 3D guns, it's even more of that. It's exacerbated. You make something on your computer and then you got to put the pin in and it's got to fit in the right way. And if it's off a little bit, it goes sideways or that's exacerbated, at least under the technology we currently have, right?
Yeah, I'd agree. And I wouldn't want to put my hand on one of those. I'm not there yet with those.
If you've ever seen anyone, and by the way, you can find them on YouTube. They literally will blow up in your hand. So just letting you folks who don't understand that know. Hannah or John, did you have anything else to add to that about the lack of precise milling for these ghost guns?
Nothing to add on that point. I think that's all, that makes a lot of sense and is consistent with what we know. One additional point is that in California for traditional handguns, there's a law called the Unsafe Handgun Act that requires manufacturers to go through a testing process, including stuff like drop testing, like does it fire if it's dropped, and various other tests that it has to undergo. And laws like that I don't remember when California adopted the Unsafe Handgun Act, but there's a history here because there have been companies in the 80s and 90s that sold junk handguns, Saturday night specials, like guns that, that were firearms. We're not talking about ghost guns, but were just poorly made and cheap and caused a lot of problems. And so it used to be traditional firearms, now it's ghost guns, but it's another reason to apply to regulate them like firearms so that the safety of the gun itself can be tested and regulated.
Good.
Yeah, and when the chief describes all the problems with these guns, I mean, it highlights the fact that it's criminals who are attracted to them. I mean, who in their right mind, who they could buy for significantly less money, a legitimate, well-made gun, who would choose to pay much more money for this gun that, is unreliable and could blow up in their hands? It's the person who has difficulty buying a gun legally because they can't pass a background check, and or someone who wants to have no serial number and have no trace and have no record.
Thank you, John. Good point. Other questions?
Yes, this next question is directed at Chief Marks, but then I think the second half of the question can kind of be opened up to all our panelists. How closely are all the different law enforcement agencies working together on this problem? Specifically, is there a great degree of coordination and data sharing among counties and with advocacy groups like Brady and Giffords?
So on firearms in general, there's a lot of great partnerships and information sharing, and it's really spearheaded nationally through ATF and FBI, through NIBIN registration, and basically any gun that we seize as evidence and we deliver to the crime lab and it's test fired, the ballistics of that is basically put into it. There's a fingerprint, and that's shared in a nationwide database. The gun is recovered with a serial number. That serial number is entered into the automated firearm system. So any law enforcement agency in the country will know that the LA County Sheriff's Department on March 31st recovered this gun under this serial number. So there is that good information. Now, when you get to ghost guns, there's really not much to share because we really don't have a model. You have a P80 or a polymer, or there's a few other names, but when you recover one of these guns, you call California Department of Justice. They give you basically a number to attach to that gun, and they get a picture of it, and that's really it. So there's no origin. Go back to what we started with. There's really no origin of that gun. We don't know where it came from or what manufacturer made it because there's nothing on it. There's no markings.
If I could, I wanted to jump in. The chief is right. For those agencies that do cooperate and do share information, it is a really interesting and powerful tool. NIBIN, for those who don't know, is the national, hang on, I looked it up just to make sure I got it right. It's ATF, it's run by ATF, the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. But we did some investigating on that as well, and not every agency cooperates. In fact, just down the street from Chief Marks in Santa Ana, they don't participate in NIBIN. They participate in another program. And so there may be a shooting literally across the street, and that gun doesn't go into the NIBIN system. So until there's a uniform one where everybody can gain from this data and this knowledge, there are holes in the system. And Chief's right, when they do cooperate, it's very powerful, but there are agencies that choose not to, or say, I like another, vendor better. In fact, in Santa Ana's case, they chose a different vendor. And so there are still issues around the nation of cooperation and of opting out. So just to let you know, it isn't all seamless. Other questions?
Yes, there's one more question I'm going to ask for now. Is there a role for public education on this issue to increase the likelihood of success with proactive legislation on guns? While many Second Amendment advocates want to be able to use guns to protect themselves, I don't think they want to have to defend against homemade gun militias as ghost guns proliferate.
John, take a crack.
Sure. Public education is extremely important. Just, attending webinars like this and finding out the information, and then speaking up to your legislators and others to change policy, not just for ghost guns, but for all gun violence prevention policies. And, when we're talking about information sharing, it's important to know that when you look at gun policy, you discover that the gun lobby has pushed Congress and won special exceptions to the law that apply to every other industry except for the gun industry. And some of those are very dangerous. And we talk about public education. The gun lobby prevailed in Congress to get appropriations riders on the ATF budget, which restricts ATF from sharing trace data publicly. Used to be when I started at Brady, you'd get a Freedom of Information Act request, and you would get the trace database, and our organization and other organizations, Giffords, could get that database. They could analyze it. Steve, you could get it, and
I did before. It's called the T-Hart Amendment, and
exactly.
I got it before the T-Hart Amendment. I actually traced guns back to police departments in Florida that were then used in other crimes subsequent. And then, of course, T-Hart came along, and now I can't get any of it.
And that's, I mean, what the story you're telling is also a part of media, of public education through the media, and exposing these problems and exposing dealers that are the big problems, manufacturers that are the big problems, and other sources. And the only reason this T-Hart rider was put in is because it was embarrassing to the gun industry, and because they wanted to continue to supply the dealers that are supplying criminals and have nobody talk about it, and have you not report about it. And it only protects bad actors. And that's just one example of special protections. And again, that's intended to keep the public ignorant of the source of some of this problem.
Good. Hannah?
Yes, totally agree with John's response. I think with ghost guns in particular, education is so important, because people don't know about these. And just as one example, I am working with Brian Muehlberger on the Administrative Procedure Act case. His daughter, Gracie Ann Muehlberger, was one of the victims who was killed at Saugus High School by another student using what's believed to be his father's ghost gun. And Brian didn't know anything about ghost guns until his daughter was killed with one. And I think that so many people are the same way, even gun owners, even people who know a basic amount about firearms, unless you professionally work with guns, unless you're a real hobbyist or enthusiast who is a fraction of gun owners, you don't necessarily know how easy it is to order a kit from the internet and build a gun with no questions asked. And so I think just educating the public, educating lawmakers is going to be really important.
Chief, education.
Yes.
So what do you think about that, and how can we do a better job?
Your story, all the stories that are out there that different media are doing are terrific. I gave you one example of last week. Another example of last week, we have a team of investigators that do nothing but enforce against armed prohibited persons getting possession of weapons. They learned of one of these people that's not allowed to possess a firearm, a convicted felon. He was trying to buy ammunition online. They were able to develop cause, write a search warrant, serve a search warrant at his house, 3 ghost guns built, 2 pistols, 1 semi-automatic rifle. He had them in his house. That's how easy it is. Stories like that, it's incumbent upon us on law enforcement to partner with media and other outlets to try to inform the public of how this is being misused. We're not trying to take guns away from lawful gun owners and people that are following the law. We want to get rid of the unlawful possession of these guns.
Good. Do we have other questions?
That's all the questions for now.
So, Hannah, I wanted to peel back a little bit of what you were saying. There are different sort of aspects of that. We've talked about 3D. We've talked about civil litigation. You mentioned some others. What else in your toolkit is there to sort of address this issue?
Well, this isn't in my toolkit personally, but just wanted to reiterate that there's civil actions that can be brought. Well, I'll talk about that, and then I'll talk about the criminal side of things, which is ongoing, because once someone's at the point of actually assembling these guns and maybe reselling them, like many gun traffickers are doing, they're subject to criminal laws, which are always being enforced in the background. But sort of on top of that, I think civil litigation is another tool that law enforcement can use, and in particular, state attorneys general in a couple of states have looked for ways to enforce state law against ghost gun companies for violating state laws that are already on the books. So one example is that in New York, the attorney general issued some cease and desist letters to ghost gun companies who were selling components that could be used to assemble assault weapons that were illegal under New York law. So it's kind of putting the existing law together and saying, what else could these components be used for? And trying to get those companies not to sell to New York or residents of states with similar laws. The Attorney General of New Jersey took a similar strategy and actually and did the same thing, tried to get companies not to sell to New Jersey residents, citing existing state law prohibiting certain types of weapons. New Jersey actually subsequently enacted a law that was specifically aimed at ghost gun components that state law enforcement was able to enforce by just informing ghost gun sellers that their products are no longer lawful to sell in New Jersey. And some of them did update their websites so that now if you put in an address from New Jersey, they can't sell it to you anymore. But there's at least one company there that did not voluntarily stop selling to New Jersey residents. And then the state attorney general was able to bring a civil consumer protection lawsuit against that seller. So it's kind of an extra civil tool to say, like, if you're selling products that are illegal for people to possess, maybe you are not violating law, but you're facilitating the violation of gun laws, and therefore you are violating the state consumer protection law. So there's kind of additional tools, but just wanted to say that in the background, when you actually get to the point of assembling these guns and maybe selling them without a license or using them in crimes, that's where the criminal law kicks in, and that's another important aspect to all of this. And I think we're going to continue to see just increases in the number of like gun trafficking rings where it's ghost guns that were built bought and built in bulk. So that's happening in the background as well.
Yeah, that my sources in law enforcement are very worried about that very thing, and I don't want to jump to what's going to be my wrap-up question, but I'll tell you everybody ahead of time. I don't like to give you my questions, but now I'm going to ask you to look in your crystal ball and sort of predict the future about what this is down the road here. Once we wrap this up, I do think the chief made a really important point too, that we're not talking about the Second Amendment and violating that and taking people's guns away, the legitimate guns away. What we're talking about is a black market of people looking to skirt the law, including the Second Amendment, and do whatever they want by manufacturing these guns on the quiet. And it is a problem that has many people on all sides of the aisle very concerned, at least people that talk to me. I wanted to peel back at the consumer protection. That's an interesting tact. I know Dr. Garen Wintemute in Sacramento at UC Davis took the health tact. And of course, now that's under fire by Congress too, that the CDC, they don't want them tracking deaths by firearms. But as Dr. Wintemute says, if people are dying 30,000 a year, that's a health crisis. Well, in this instance, maybe it's a consumer protection. Hannah, is there some more legitimacy to pull, more string to pull in that realm?
Yes, I think it's an important tool for states to use. Actually, under federal law, I think this was also due to a gun industry engineered legislation. The Consumer Product Safety Commission doesn't have any jurisdiction over firearms. So there are, I mean, this is a consumer product. People are buying it and keeping it in their homes, and it needs to not be defective. It needs to, you could see the advantages of putting it under the purview of an entity that regulates products, but it's not done that way. And so that's the barrier to trying to adopt a consumer protection approach under federal law.
Interesting. John, talk a little bit about that. Is there something more at consumer protection? But again, as Hannah points out, I did not realize that the Consumer Protection Agency can't oversee firearms. Interesting how the gun lobby can avoid that, just like CDC. We don't want you tracking deaths either.
Right. I mean, the gun industry is the only industry in America that is exempt from federal product safety oversight, that has some protection from civil liability, that has some protection from the Freedom of Information Act, that handcuffs law enforcement in some ways, federal law enforcement, eliminating spot inspections in many cases. So that's certainly a huge problem. You know, the consumer product safety actions at the state level can be very effective. And in some of our litigation, we've invoked the California unfair business practice law, and there are other states that have done that for going after assault weapon manufacturers and other things. So that's certainly a promising, legal avenue. But one thing I'd like to add to this that exacerbates all these problems is the online gun market. And we have this thriving, unregulated marketplace of guns on the internet with companies that also choose to do nothing to prevent illegal gun sales and gun purchasing through their sites. And we've seen a bunch of ghost guns as well as conventional guns sold to prohibited people through these websites. So you've got to crack down on those as well, also because they're designed to make it very easy to shop across state lines. And so you can go online in California, let's say California, passes some good laws. You could go online, you could find a purchaser in Nevada or Arizona and, arrange to buy what you want in the parking lot of a McDonald's, which is what usually happens, and then go back across to California.
We had a gentleman who actually went to Missouri and would buy them all online, put them in microwave ovens and ship them back to San Francisco and sell them on the streets of San Francisco. So he said it was easy peasy, easy money. And he got guns that were worth 4 times in San Francisco what they were worth in Missouri. So you're absolutely right, John. Do you see, because of we talk about this in the media every time there's a mass shooting? We had Boulder, we had Atlanta. Do you see a change in the political climate, and since there is a new administration, that there may be an opening for legislation that a year ago we wouldn't be talking about?
I mean, I think there definitely is, and it's been coming for a number of years, where the politics of guns has changed. I mean, I've been at Brady for close to 25 years, and it used to be that conservatives, usually Republicans, even though we're a bipartisan organization, would love to force gun bills to a vote, because they wanted, before the election, I mean, the mantra used to be God, gays, and guns. Those were the hot button issues. They wanted to get Democrats on the record so that then they could, distort their position in a bumper sticker, and that's what they would run on in the election. Now we see exactly the opposite. I mean, Mitch McConnell was bending over backwards to prevent any gun legislation to go to the floor of the Senate, because he didn't want his senators to have to take an unpopular stand on behalf of the gun lobby, because he knew that was a loser, even in red states. So the politics has completely changed. And of course, Congress is well behind the American people. I mean, there's over 90% support for universal background checks. There's majority support for virtually all of Brady's agenda, including majorities of gun owners. So, the people are behind it. It actually is not a very divisive issue in America. It's divisive on Capitol Hill, where they're influenced by the NRA. But so, yes, change is coming, and it will be tough, but I am optimistic.
As John said, Hannah, one red state is your namesake, Gabby Giffords in Arizona, and the strategy the Gifford Center has sort of adopted, and it has been a much more, face it head on. I was reading, I think, a Vanity Fair article, and it's been very successful. Do you see a change and that there might be more success in the near future? And again, not taking guns away. I want to reiterate what the chief said, but having common sense legislation that keeps bad people from manufacturing in their backyard and selling them, that are then used in killings that can't be traced.
Yes, I think John's exactly right that it has always been that there are very high levels of support for responsible gun regulations, things like background checks, even restricting the types of weapons that are most commonly used in mass shootings. But the problem is our political leaders are not enacting the will of the voters. And then I think it's always presented as a more divisive issue than it is when opponents of background checks claim that it's about gun confiscation, when it's about a background check that all responsible gun owners are happy to complete. So there's some distortion in the way that the issue is discussed. I just also wanted to highlight, I think, the role of that younger voters are playing after the horrible tragedy at Parkland in Florida in 2018. There was a huge amount of momentum, youth-led movement to support gun safety policies, but also register voters. And I think younger people are really concerned about school shootings, about gun violence that happens every day, you know, the types of shootings that don't get media attention. That's what people are concerned about. And so there's a demographic shift that's leading to broader support for gun safety policies as well.
Chief, do you see a change, or do you despair? I talked to a lot of law enforcement, and they tend to be on the conservative side, but on this issue, they're like, we don't want to take your guns. We just want to do common sense and keep our people safer. What your position? Do you think there is change on the horizon, or do you think that we're going to continue to sort of battle this out and nothing changes?
That's hard to say, you know, and you said it, bad people are going to do bad things. Criminals are going to commit crimes. And what this has done is made it very easy for criminals to take opportunity and put guns in their hands. You know, so whether something's going to change in the immediate horizon, I couldn't tell you that. I'm not, you know, involved in the legislative making process. I'm just going to enforce the law the best that I can. So it's just, it's really difficult. But, you know, with everything that's going on in the nation, you know, much more grander view, you know, where law enforcement, you know, we're taking a look at ourselves and our legitimate practices and improving our practices. And meanwhile, there's, you know, alternatives to incarceration and all these other types of things that we're talking about. It gives more opportunities, and it emboldens the evil people in our society that are going to do bad things to do more bad things. So I mentioned that murder rate in LA County is up 130%. I can't tell you one specific reason why that's up, because it's up for domestic violence murders. It's up with the mentally ill committing crimes. You know, it's across the board. Every type of murder that you can imagine is happening.
So I'm going to follow up, Chief, if you don't mind. You may have already answered this because you sort of said make them illegal, but when we're talking about these ghost guns in particular, the untraceable, the self-made, unserialized firearms, what thoughts do you have that would help you? What tools could you use as a law enforcement to make a more immediate impact on enforcement in this issue?
That's exactly it. It's just for this issue, we don't know who made them, who shipped them, who bought them. They're just on the street as a gun. They just appeared, magic. So we need to be able, it needs to be just like anything else, regulated from start to finish.
Hannah, what issues in litigation have you found with these weapons? Is it easy to litigate when a ghost gun's involved?
Well, I think going back to the Administrative Procedure Act challenges, that's something that's available with ghost guns, because the reason they're not regulated is because of a federal agency determination. The other thing I'll highlight is that because ghost guns are not regulated as firearms under federal law, and sellers of ghost guns don't claim to be selling firearms, they're trying to say that they are not selling firearms, it may be easier to bring certain actions against them because there's a gun industry immunity law for traditional firearms. So that's another kind of a law that fits into the theme that John and you, Steve, were talking about, of kind of special treatment for the gun industry, exemptions from law.
So these folks aren't immune under immunity, right? Is that correct?
Yes, if they're not selling firearms, and many of them don't have a federal firearms license, which I think is another component required to get immunity. But yeah, and so then just for some background, the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act gives an unprecedented level of immunity to the manufacturers and sellers of firearms. And so it's kind of a technical definition, and I don't have it in front of me, so I don't want to give an imperfect summary, but I think that you can say ghost gun manufacturers, the people who are selling 80% frames and receivers aren't entitled to that immunity. And that makes sense because the whole point is that their business is that federal law doesn't classify what they're selling as firearms, and the immunity law is for firearms and firearm components. So that's one possibility, and it's kind of an irony for these businesses that if they want to say they're not selling firearms, well then they maybe can't benefit from the firearms industry immunity law.
Fascinating. I hadn't thought of that. Jon, you filed the first victim lawsuit against the ghost gun industry. Are we going to see more of those going forward, you think? Is that the way forward?
Well, I mean, I think Hannah was right when she said it's sort of, all of these approaches need to be taken, and there certainly will be more victim lawsuits that are brought because there's going to be more victims, unfortunately. But you also need the important administrative lawsuit that Giffords is bringing, and also the state attorney general's actions and all of that. I do want to go back to something that the chief said about the spike in homicides locally and the related to police reforms. I mean, and to start out, I mean, a lot of Brady's work, we've represented police officers and continue to who've been shot, often killed in the line of duty. And there's certainly is nothing more tragic. But it's important to know that there is no other country, comparable country, that endures or allows anything like the levels of gun violence that we do in America. And these are countries that have very similar problems of whether it's criminal elements, or whether it's the conditions that lead to crime, whether it's mental illness, whether it's depression that would lead to suicide. All of those causal factors apply equally, if not more, in some of these other comparable countries. They have a tiny, tiny fraction of the gun violence problem that we do. And the only reason for that is because of our gun laws. That is it. And it's because Congress has completely failed the American people to protect the American people from gun violence. They've put the gun industry ahead of the safety of Americans time and again. Hopefully that is changing. But whenever we hear other potential causes of crime, it may completely be valid. That leads to spikes in crime in the United States. But the reason why our crime is lethal and kills people is because of access to guns. And those same crimes that happen in other countries, other comparable countries, are not lethal because those criminals don't have guns.
We're starting to wind down here, but before we get to that, I had one last sort of issue to peel back on, and that is sentencing. Right now, as I understand it, the sentencing laws are, well, let's let you all classify them. If I get caught with a ghost gun, what kind of sentence am I looking at? And first of all, am I breaking a law by merely possessing a ghost gun? And that's one without a serial number, and I can't tell you where I got it. Is it illegal to possess it? And then if I use it in the commission of a crime, is there a tack on? I know in California, there are sentence enhancements for using, if you're a member of a gang, if you use a gun in a commission of a, but if it's a ghost gun, are there more legal repercussions for me? And as I understand it, there aren't, at least not very significant ones. Do we need sentencing laws that are a little tougher? I'll start with you, Chief.
Well, that's a tough one here in Los Angeles County because we're going through a few changes on that. However, the good thing about California is that the minute you can buy an 80%er, but the minute you start to work on it, if you don't send that through the Department of Justice, it's an illegal firearm. So I think we have adequate laws to address once that becomes a firearm. And if you're in possession of it, it's an unserialized firearm. So I think we're adequate in California there. It's just the delivery to the doorstep.
But if I get caught that, I understand the sentences aren't nearly as tough as, say, if I use it or, other things. I could be wrong. Am I right about that? Or?
No, you're right. And that's part of the discussion that we're living through right now is, what's the appropriate sentences for for crimes. And, in a year or two from now, I think we'll probably be in a different place and we'll have a little more clarity. But I think right now, at least for us in Los Angeles County, it's we're working through this new era.
Yeah,
John?
I think we've got to look higher up the food chain. I mean, the problem is this industry that is making money off of supplying criminals. And police officers are being killed with these guns. Civilians are being killed with these guns. And there are companies that see it as profitable. And to me, that is a much more serious problem facing California and the country than, the sentence for particular criminals. The fact is, if you dealt with the industry, those criminals would not be able to get these guns.
Are we dealing with the industry?
Well, on a federal level, we aren't. We've talked about some of the state actions and civil lawsuits that are going after the industry, and that's certainly a big focus of ours at Brady. But I just think in the ghost guns and also generally in the general gun violence problem, we need to focus more on the role of the industry that chooses to profit off the criminal market, they simply are refuse time and again to institute reasonable measures which would prevent supplying the criminal market because they make money off it. And that's the sad truth.
It is interesting you bring up, you would think Glock and Smith & Wesson and, Colt would want to shut this down. And yet it seems like even merely raising your hand to say that is, oh, you're against all guns, and it becomes the default position. Is there some leadership from the legitimate gun companies to address at least the ghost gun issue in your mind?
Absolutely no leadership. And Smith & Wesson, the story I told you about them,
right.
is an example of what happens when you step out of line. They'll punish you. I mean, after the Parkland shooting, Colts said we're going to stop manufacturing assault rifles. As a boycott threatened on them, they flipped. They changed their position. It even some cases forces gun companies or encourages them to do things that are against their financial interests. I mean, Colts, whether it was true or not, said there was a glut in the market, and that's why they were doing it. And people and the industry basically said, you better keep on producing them anyway, or we're going to boycott you. So there is absolutely, no leadership in the industry doing the right thing. And so you need this federal action to force them. And so far, what Congress has done, and Hannah spoke to this, is give them a free pass through the rules that apply to every other industry in America.
Hannah, do we need tougher sentences when it comes to ghost guns?
I agree with John and the chief. I think you're too late. If you're looking at the people who are just illegally possessing a ghost gun, it's too late. It's too low down on the food chain because you're not getting at the source of the problem, and it would just keep recurring. And I think the reason why there's no leadership from the industry side of things is that it's in their interest to put a distance between the end user and their own obligations as a company to make sure that their products are being used lawfully. And that applies to the traditional firearm industry, just as it applies to ghost gun sellers who are just having you check a box like, oh, I'm not a prohibited person. There's no, you can say whatever you want on a company's website. And a lot of them are marketing their product in ways that I think any other company in an industry that hasn't operated like this would be extremely nervous about their legal liability. Like there's ads from these companies saying like, you don't have to go through the hassle of a licensed dealer. Just signaling like this is the easy way to get a gun without a background check. You can buy them in bulk, all of that, and it's just the way that the industry has set up to operate, that it's with impunity. They have not had to worry about following the same types of like self-regulating responsible business practices that other industries have, because they've gotten immunity from Congress and have just kind of taken this lockstep approach that they have no obligation to the end user, to the victims of gun violence. And so I think that has to change, and the way for it to change is to go after the source.
So I have to ask, and I think this comes when I read about Gabby Gifford saying that, in fact, the power of the gun lobby is not as strong as perceived. If, in fact, the majority of Americans are for some type of regulation, for stopping the bad guys from getting this, why does a Smith & Wesson, well, I guess they went out of business, John said. Why do these companies capitulate? Why does Congress capitulate? If, in fact, the American public is in one corner, why are the specialists in the other corner? How is that tenable, and how does that continue to happen, this imbalance?
Well, for one, I mean, there have been studies about gun ownership in America that has shown this increasing number of, I think they're called super buyers, where you have a fairly small percentage of people who just buy a ton of guns. And those people tend to have very extreme views. So even if it's maybe a small percentage of gun owners, they have sort of outsized influence, and they've got very, very extreme views. So I think that those sorts of folks, and then extremists in the NRA, and the NRA takes positions that are contrary to NRA members. I mean, most NRA members support a lot of sensible gun violence prevention measures. And, hopefully through what we're seeing, the circus that we're seeing, the NRA going through with where it's, revealed where they've been basically taking gun owners' dues and using them to buy $1,000 suits for Wayne LaPierre.
Travel, yeah.
Lots and things like that. And, these are hardworking people paying their dues, and they've been sold a bill of goods by the NRA. So, hopefully that will lead to gun owners being represented in accordance with their views, which may be different from mine in some ways, and Hannah's in some ways, but we do agree on things like background checks, and I think on ghost guns would agree that these are guns and they should be treated as guns.
Hannah, how is it possible that if people say bad guys shouldn't be getting guns that don't have serial numbers on it, it still happens?
Yeah, I think we've talked about this a bunch in different contexts, but it's like, why are we making it so easy? I think there's the argument that people make in opposition to passing gun regulations, adopting things like background checks, the most basic measures that just criminals will not follow the law, and so there's no point. But we have never been able to test that, because most, so many criminals, certainly most like high profile mass shooters, get their weapons legally. And it's very easy to do that. It's easy to do that in most states with traditional firearms. And then in states like California that have stronger laws, it's easy to do with ghost guns. And so we're making it so easy for people, it's reasonable to conclude, and I think that the data backs this up, and what we see in states that do regulate firearms, if you look at international comparisons like John did, that just make it less easy, and you're gonna solve some of the crimes. You're gonna stop people from getting a gun if they can they're only doing it because it is the easiest, most destructive weapon that they can put their hands on. And I think that gets missed, that it is significant that right now people don't have to break the law because we're not requiring them to jump through any hoops to get a firearm and use it the next hour, the same day. And so I think that, ghost guns are the current manifestation of the problem in some places, but traditional firearms have been like that this whole time.
And to your point, both the shooter in Atlanta and Boulder bought their guns legally, and I believe the Boulder gentleman bought his 6 hours before he went and shot up the grocery store. Chief, your thoughts? Why can't common sense prevail? Why do we continue to have this discussion? I know you've been in law enforcement a long time.
Yeah, that's a loaded question, and I'm just a simple policeman that wants to do my job and help people. So our legislatures have to figure that out.
It is going to take legislation, though, from your view.
For this, yeah. I mean, I've in 30 plus years, we've seen, the first flip phones that were easy to stick a little piece of foil in the back, and Toyota Camrys with a popsicle stick in the ignition. I mean, so many times, and we've adopted and changed, and private industries adopted and changed to these things, and legislature has adopted. But this is really dangerous, and they're pumping these out. We don't know, by the millions, probably, right? We have no idea how many are out there. So they really need to do something about this particular gap right now.
Yeah, you make a point. I was thinking about that. The car industry, absolutely. It's changed so much over the last several decades, and yet we all still have to register our car and get a license to drive a car. I do wonder if we had a third amendment that protected my right to do a car, would I just drive around without any registration or license for an automobile, which can also kill people? I want to go back to Rachel and Clodagh. Do we have any more questions? If not, I'll wrap it up with one final question.
Yes, there's one additional question, and then I'll turn it back over to you. So the question is, for people that are building from the 80% legally, are they supposed to get it certified before starting to work on them when the holes aren't in place, or are they supposed to get it certified once it's fully built?
Chief, I'll let you start because I know you know that, and John and Hannah, I'll let you weigh in. But Chief, go ahead.
Well, my first is go to the DOJ website. Don't take what I'm saying as absolute, but my understanding is you buy the 80% or you get it delivered. Before you start to work on it, you go online to the Cal DOJ website, you apply for a FEMBUS number, they ship you the number, you do the work, and then you take pictures of the completed firearm, fill out the rest of the paperwork, and then they will determine whether it's a California legal gun or not, and then authorize you to own it. I think I got it right, but check the website.
That's how I understand it, Chris. That's how I understand it. John? And that is different to California than other states. Other states, you don't do anything. So at least California's trying, but again, if you don't want to, you don't do any of that. John?
I have nothing to add to that.
Okay.
Hannah does.
Hannah?
Yeah, you got to go to the source, whatever state you're in. You go to state law enforcement, make sure you're complying with the rules. It's, it isn't that many states where you do have to worry about that, but California is one of them.
Well, we'll wrap up with my final question. I want to thank our panelists, Chief Marks, John, and Hannah. You guys have been fabulous. This has been a really invigorating discussion. I hope the people have been listening this whole time, and I see we really haven't lost anybody. So we've kept most people engaged. I hope you got something out of it, and we understand the breadth and the depth and the seriousness of the issue of ghost guns, or what's known legally as the self-made unserialized firearms. I want to ask each of you to look in your crystal ball. I know you probably don't like to do that. I know the chief doesn't, because I know lots of law enforcement, but what do you see if nothing changes? I asked Graham Barlow at ATF. He says he really worries about it. But if nothing changes, what do you see happening in the next 5 to 10 years on this issue of ghost guns? And tell us how worried you are about what the future holds if nothing changes. Chief, I'll start with you.
That's a tough question. It's the amount of people that are willing to use these guns in a criminal manner. And so what the future holds for that, I mean, it's anybody can get these guns now. So will there just be more and more guns out there and the same amount of violence and crime, or will there be more used with more of these? I couldn't tell you that.
Do you worry about your future if nothing changes?
Well, yeah, I worry about, the innocent victims they're going to be victimized by, criminals that are going to exploit this gap in the law by using these weapons against them. Those are who I worry about. I have a gun. I worry about the people that are, law-abiding citizens that don't.
John?
Well, if nothing changes, I think everyone's going to know what a ghost gun is because it will be so prevalent. And I think particularly when you have sort of shadowy networks, whether it's sort of, white supremacist fringe groups or other terrorist groups that really want to stay under the radar until they, commit really horrific violence, they'll be extremely attracted to these sorts of things where they can be completely undetected. And I think it's inevitable that we will see that sort of violence using these guns if Congress doesn't do anything. But I am hopeful that Congress and other states will take some good action.
It's interesting you bring that up, John. I guess that was one thing I forgot to ask everybody, but my sources in Homeland Security echo what you just said, and that there are actually foreign actors who recognize this loophole and may exploit it. And, again, not an ISIS but some group like an ISIS or who did 9/11 could do something on a similar scale because this is such a serious threat to Homeland Security, not just government actors, but just foreign terrorist groups, as well as domestic terrorist groups that could exploit this. And they are very worried about it. You're absolutely right. Hannah, I'm going to let you have the last word.
Well, it's an easy answer, just what John just said, more ghost guns. Then look at the past 5 years, this is really a problem that has grown in the last 5 years. All the cities in California have reported staggering increases in the number of ghost guns recovered. Like in San Francisco, where I work, no ghost guns were recovered in 2015. And my notes say that from 2016 to 2019, there was a 1,517% increase in the number of ghost guns recovered. So it is the problem that's grown exponentially to reach its current scale, and it will keep growing if nothing's done about it.
Thank you all for again joining us. And Rachel, I'm going to turn it back to you. I went overtime. My producer would be yelling at me right now in my ear. Wrap it up.
No worries. It's a very interesting topic. I just need 1 minute of the audience's time, and then we will all be out of here. For the raffle, we've already done a random generator number where we just took the amount of people in the room. We lost a few folks to 6:30 p.m. classes, but most folks did stay. So we do have an organization. Thank you, Hannah, for suggesting it. It's Youth Alive, which is based out of Oakland. They have been around since 1991 trying to prevent violence, which includes gun violence. It's not just gun violence, but violence in the communities, and also creating young leaders that will set good examples and also try to prevent violence in their communities. So with that, we want to raffle off a donation. We'll do that donation from the Litigation Center, but we'll put it in the recipient's name. And you also get a free sweatshirt, I believe, based on the donation as well. So the person who won that raffle is Ashley Yamas. If she's still here, we will get your information. If we need anything other than your name, we'll let you know. If you don't want to have your name on that donation, you let us know. We can have it regifted in someone else's name that you'd like. Okay, so that's the raffle. And thank you. I want to say thank you to our panelists for being here. It was very intriguing. Me and my colleague Chloe were texting back and forth saying, wow, this is really interesting topic. I mean, there's so many gray areas here to work with. So thank you for being here. Extra big shout out to Stephen Stock for moderating the panel. You saved me a lot of work, but you also did an excellent job. You're very knowledgeable on this topic. And again, thank you all for being here. It's a good 2-hour section on Zoom. We're all going to go out and go take a nap now. So thank you. We appreciate it, and we hope to see you soon. And thank you for all of our attendees. We'll see you in classes.